So good evening.
Good evening.
How are we all doing?
Doing great.
And we're back for another wonderful class, our final class in this series, which is kind of sad. I've really been loving this. And I want to begin, as we always do, but tonight especially, by thanking our core sponsors, Nancy Trias, Beth and Eli Morocco, and Toby and Larry Fox. Thank you all for bringing, for all of us here. We've had, I believe, 53 people joining our summer course, which is very good for a summer course, especially between night and day class and Zoom and in person. So I want to thank you all for such a beautiful experience that we're all studying together. And our sages tell us that the summertime is especially a good time to study Torah, especially at night, by the way. So this is nighttime study. All right. And on that note, I want to share with you all what is going to be coming up. So tonight, this course ends, right? Unfortunately. And two things. Number one, we're going to be restarting our weekly Tanya classes in another week or two. What I'm going to do is, so for those of you who have not joined, so the Tanya is a classic and most loved Hasidic text. And we've been doing, over the past year, I think we've done 15 classes. It's an hour a week. We've actually been doing it on Wednesdays in between the courses, whenever we don't have the 6-week JLI course in session. It's text study, so it's different, a little bit of a different style. And we've been learning Tanya together. So that class is going to be restarting, but I want to move it to a different day of the week. Maybe it's going to be moved to Monday. So there's a morning option, an evening option. So for those of you who have joined, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I'll be sending out emails about that. And then right after the holidays, we are moving on to a brand new course titled My God, a thought-provoking JLI course that answers your every question on perceiving, defining, and approaching God. So God is the top word in Judaism, but the least defined word. It's given the least airtime. This is a real good 6-week course that answers 26 top questions about God. So it's gonna be a very fun course. I'm moving through a lot of different questions. Each class is a general theme. So stay tuned for our next course, My God, starting in like another 2 months or so.
Yeah, Rabbi.
Yes.
I keep waiting for you to put up some bad content so I can take a break.
A break?
You never put up bad content.
Listen, we try. So you're right. You're saying, when could you take a break?
Well, maybe when it's not so interesting.
Let's do one boring course. Now, the real truth is that every course has a different appeal. And what I like doing is as much variety as possible. It's like that. Everybody, it touches the interest point of everybody. And like that, people are always finding a very good entry point to studying and learning Torah. So this is this course. It's a wonderful course. So I'm very excited for it. It's gonna be a very fun course, very interesting, because we all take the word God for granted, as if like everybody knows what we're talking about. And I do the same. You mentioned God in the class, just like God, that's it. But this is really gonna go back to bare bones, ask every hard question, and really give a wonderful opportunity for that. Okay, and with that, here we are at lesson 6. We're going to be talking about the last issue, revolving around the 6-Day War, its aftermath, its effects on the Jewish world, a nation that dwells alone, Israel's relations with the family of nations, anti-Israel sentiment, anti-Semitism, and of course we are living with that till today. This is something which has not changed. From then, 1967, 55 years later, we're still suffering through the criticism and antipathy, this constant bias against Israel. And I want to discuss that with you tonight, explore it from a Jewish perspective, God willing. Before we jump into that, I want to make a little prelude, a little bit of a prologue. I want to begin with an event that is actually the very first chapter in the 6-Day War story. But not many people know about it. This is really the event that first precipitated the war, which is really about a year before the war. So here's going to be a video, and this is going to be our prelude to today's discussion. There you go. You're on it. Okay, here we go.
Water is the elixir of life. But water allocation can be a deadly affair. In the Middle East, where temperaments mirror the soaring temperatures and prejudices flow freely, the price of water is sometimes paid in blood. After the State of Israel declared independence in 1948, its leaders put their heads together to develop a water plan that would provide desperately needed fluid for drinking and irrigation purposes. Israel came up with the National Water Carrier Project, a plan to draw water from the Kinneret Lake in its north through a technically challenging network of canals, tunnels, and pipes covering a diversity of terrain and elevations, all the way down Israel's west coast to its populated center and to its parched agricultural south. The Kinneret, also known as the Sea of Galilee, is a picturesque lake in Israel's north, ringed with beaches, meadows, and mountains. It is approximately 35 miles in circumference and 150 feet at its deepest point. It held enough water to meet the demands of Israel's expanding population for decades. However, this wonderful freshwater asset is inherently fragile. It is fed mainly by the waters of the Jordan River, which originates in the gushing springs and tributaries of mountainous Lebanon and Syria. Two rivers are especially critical to the aqua that courses down the Jordan Valley before flowing into Lake Kinneret: the Hasbani in Lebanon and the Banias in Syria. Without these two rivers, the Jordan's waters would drop dramatically. The Kinneret's water level would also drop, and its remaining freshwater would be irreversibly salinized by the salt springs sitting on its bed. While Israel simply wanted to have a drink, their plan drew the ire of her neighbors. Having failed to eradicate Israel in the 1948 War of Independence, the Arab world swore to at least limit her growth and economic success. Israel's water project threatened to severely undermine that goal. When Israel began construction on the national water carrier in July of 1953, the war over water was set in motion. Hostilities emerged in 3 stages that served as stepping stones towards a full-scale Arab-Israeli conflict. As Israel's tractors bit into soil north of the Kinneret, Syrian artillery units roared into action, bombarding the Israeli construction site. Syria demanded that the United Nations intervene against Israel. The Security Council wished to uphold Israel's right to resume work on its water project, but the Soviets vetoed the resolution. Israel modified its plan, moved its construction site further from Syria's border, and its engineers went back to work. But the dispute was just warming up. Syria and Jordan then colluded to divert the Yarmouk River. The Yarmouk would be forced to flow away from Israel and instead supplement the Jordanians' irrigation needs. United States President Eisenhower dispatched Ambassador Eric Johnston to resolve the situation. The result was the 1955 Johnston Plan, a brave attempt at coexistence and water sharing that Israel embraced and that the Arab League unofficially resolved to abide by, at least temporarily. The waves of war were thereby stilled for most of a decade. In 1964, Israel completed the national water carrier. It was 81 miles in length and had taken years to build at the cost of hundreds of millions of Israeli lira. But it was worth every lira. The carrier was capable of funneling an astonishing 19 million gallons of water per hour, an achievement far too great for Israel's Arab neighbors to swallow. The Arab League hastily convened in Cairo. Desperate to wreck Israel's water resource, they devised a reckless plan. The Headwater Diversion Plan called for the reduction of the water carrier's capacity by 35% by diverting its headwaters. both the Hasbani in Lebanon and the Banyas in Syria, into the Yarmouk River, deep in Jordanian territory. At the same time, the Arab League clarified that this was not simply a war about liquid, but rather liquidation. Since the existence of Israel is a danger that threatens the Arab nation, the diversion of the Jordan waters by it multiplies the dangers to Arab existence. Accordingly, the Arab states have to prepare so that if necessary results are not achieved, collective Arab military preparations will constitute the ultimate practical means for the final liquidation of Israel. Israel warned that the Headwater Diversion Plan would infringe on its sovereign rights. In other words, it would be considered an act of war. The Arabs, however, were not opposed to a war. They launched their project, and the skirmishes began. In 1965, there were 3 high-profile border clashes. The Syrian military attacked Israeli farmers and army patrols, and Israel responded by sending tanks and artillery to destroy the Arab heavy earth-moving machines that were working on the diversion plan. The Arab states eventually abandoned their project, but the war over water inspired them to plot a war of extermination against Israel. Hostilities between Israel and Syria spiraled over the next 2 years, with Syria using the Golan Heights to rain artillery upon unprotected Israeli farms and villages in the plains below. In the first quarter of 1967, there were over 270 border incidents of sabotage and attack directed against Israel. A view of the war to come came on April 7th, when Syria fired at Israeli farmers. Israel responded with artillery, and the fight escalated. Israel sent planes against Syrian positions and villages, and in an ensuing aerial dogfight, Israel downed 6 Syrian fighter jets and chased the remainder all the way back to Damascus. Ariel Sharon later observed, "People generally regard June 5, 1967, as the day the Six-Day War began. That is the official date. But in reality, it started 2.5 years earlier, on the day Israel decided to act against the diversion of the Jordan River. In fact, it could be argued that the war began as soon as a parched Israel politely asked the Kinneret for a drink."
So, this is a very interesting, somewhat unknown piece of information. The war really begins over water, and it's not just a small, little historical, fact. It's really very characteristic of Israel. Every single time, really the first time we meet Israel for the first time in the Torah, when Abraham is beckoned by God to leave his father's home and travel to the land that I will show you, Abraham reaches Israel, and what happens as soon as he gets there? There's a drought. This becomes a recurring theme. In Isaac's days, there's a drought. In Jacob's days, there's a drought. That's what pulls the Jews to Egypt. Throughout the Talmud, throughout the teachings of the sages, there's so many stories, and we just know drought was very, very ubiquitous of Israel. It's just part of the story of the land. And in fact, I'm going to read this with you. Moses warns the Jewish people that God's going to bring them to the promised land, but Moses warns them the water situation in Israel is a little bit different than what it was in Egypt. So let's read that in text 1, page 220. Max, you want to begin?
Sure. The land into which you are entering to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have left. There you planted your seed and watered your fields by bringing water from the Nile by foot, like a vegetable garden. But the land that you are crossing, the Jordan River, to possess is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven.
So in Egypt, there was a Nile River, and Egypt, part of just, I guess, the lay of the land, they had a very intricate network of these canals that irrigated all the fields, and water was never an issue in Egypt. And that's in fact why in Egypt, what was the god of Egypt? The Nile River, because that was their financial security, their economic security. Israel did not have any type of water supply that would be able to help them for that. And both for practical living purposes, for industry. Israel had no source of water, and this is generational. This was always the case. Israel was always reliant on rainwater. And when you rely on rainwater, especially in the desert, there can be droughts. In fact, there's a whole tractate of Talmud that is, it's called Yuma, Tractate Yuma. It's all about Jewish fast days. So we have 5 fast days on the calendar, like one of them was Tisha B'Av that we just had, right? But in fact, if you open up the Tractate Yuma, most of the fast days that it discusses are over droughts. When there's a drought, you have to ask God for help. And all the regular fast days that we know of are only towards the end of the tractate. The main focus is when and how to enact fast days when there's a drought in Israel. And this leads us to our opening question of today's class. If God gave us a promised land, why couldn't it be perfect? Right? Why? Golda Meir once said, the only complaint I have against God is, if he's going to bring us into some little piece of land in the Middle East, why do you have to choose the only piece that doesn't have any oil? That's what she said. But for tonight's purposes, it's like a funny thing. Why is it that Israel, and it's become so characteristic of Israel, it's a land of milk and honey, but the land of no water? Why? What's the idea to that?
I was in Jordan a couple of years ago, and I went to Mount Nebo, which is supposed where the site where Moses finally died and was buried, and where he looked out at the land. And I was expecting to see sort of milk and honey, and it was very
dry
and desolate.
Okay, it also depends on the season. Sometimes it's very green, sometimes it's not. But that's the question for today. And we'll only get back to this question later on in today's class. What just happened? So this is going to be our opening question. And with that, let's move on to anti-Israel sentiments, which some like to call as well anti-Semitism. Some say it's not anti-Semitism, some say it is anti-Semitism. Let's talk a little bit about it. Israel, as we all know, faces immense pressure and criticism and bias worldwide, especially from influential bodies, the media, the UN, et cetera, which is such an interesting, what's up with that? It's like weird. One little country, I mentioned this last week, and I Googled it. It didn't have a source on it, so I didn't want to show it because I don't know where it's from. It seems like it's from like some Reddit thread, and I didn't have time to really see if it's well sourced. You could look it up. You could Google it. What is the most hated nation in every country? Go to every single country and ask them, who do you hate most? Is it China? Is it Russia? For some countries, it's America. And half of the map is Israel. And the funny thing is, you can't even see Israel on that map, right? So yeah, it's like a graph, a whole map, and they have in every single country a flag. It's crazy. What is up with the hate? And that's what I want to talk about tonight. Why is this happening? What could we be doing about it? How do we understand it? That's going to be tonight's class. But some people say that we Jews are a little bit too sensitive. Every single time somebody opens up their mouth against Israel, we run and we say, you're biased, you're hating, you're an anti-Semite. Who said? You're not allowed to criticize Israel. Israel's off limits. The real truth is, in this course, while I hope and I believe that the tone of this course was with tremendous love to our homeland, the land of Israel, I was critical at times. I raised certain issues where I felt the Israeli government did not do the right thing. So is that anti-Semitism? Is that wrong? So I think it's important to, before we go on further, to clarify what makes criticism of Israel legitimate and when is it not legitimate? When could we be comfortable calling it out as anti-Semitism and when not? It's in your books on page 221. What I want to do over here is focus on two of the most important qualifications. This is a litmus test between legitimate criticism and illegitimate. The first one is fear. Fear criticism. So let's read it over here in the books. If there's equal critique, I'll read it in the book. It's a little bit different on the screen. Equal and proportionate critique of all who are in violation of a consistently applied standard. So fear simply means there's consistency. There's no double standard. You know, if you are somebody who wants to advocate for human rights violations, no problem. Call it out wherever you find it. That's fair. Fair means that this is a real agenda that you have and you're applying it fairly, you're applying it across the board. You don't just wake up when it's only about Israel. That's the first thing. The second important litmus test is this criticism objective? What's objective? Follow the facts wherever they lead. Does not attempt to reconcile facts with a prescripted narrative or selectively focus on facts that are compatible with the narrative. Very, very simple. Do you have an agenda that you're just trying to fit the facts into? Do you have a conclusion before you even know what happened? If so, that's not called objective, right? Like the story goes, there's once a anti-Semitic police officer. He shows up to a crash and he sees in the front vehicle, it's a bender fender, somebody bumped into somebody from the back. In the back was a non-Jew, in the front is a Jew. So the police officer walks over to the non-Jew and says, tell me, how fast was that Jew backing up when he hit you? Understand? Or like there's also the story that there's in France, there's once a dog who was biting and attacking a little girl, and a man shows up and shoots the dog. So the police come over, the media comes over, say, you know, who's this hero who saved this little girl? He said, I'm a Jew, I'm an Israeli. The next day in the newspapers, what did it say? Israeli shoots dog in the streets of Paris. Okay, so these are the types of things that you look at, and that's called you're not being objective, you're not being fair. You're using a conclusion that you have a certain prejudice, and you're just always twisting the facts to fit that agenda. And with that, I want to show you now another video. And this is a video that summarizes, and it's quite shocking when you actually see it. You know, we all know the UN is very biased against Israel. When you really have a summary of the facts, it's scary. It's really scary. So here's a video that brings us really up to date to 2021. Doesn't have 2022 data. I don't know if it's out yet. Okay, I could do it next time, Sean, because I'm going to be working you today.
We're taking turns.
You're taking turns? Okay,
We're
all right.
making sure our hips stay joined.
Very good, very good. Good exercise. But
That's
okay,
right.
if you're, and here we go. Here's another video about UN bias. And you tell me if this is fair and or even objective. So here we go.
On the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah Wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2016 until 2020, the Assembly adopted 122 resolutions criticizing various countries. 91 of these targeted Israel. That's 75% of all country-specific resolutions. And while 3/4 of this global forum's written rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 40 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years before the Palestinian Liberation Organization even nominally forswore terrorism, the Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part in its deliberations. This was the first time that anyone who was neither a government representative nor a head of a quasi-state was granted such a privilege. The following year, the Assembly awarded the PLO permanent representative status. A few months later, the UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to May 2021, Israel was condemned in no less than 94 Human Rights Council resolutions. During the same period, Syria was condemned 36 times, North Korea 14 times, and China has been spared condemnation altogether. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment at the UN.
There are some bias against the Israeli people and government.
In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
A disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
One of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, but like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, no? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not the. There's other really bad happening. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all of the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
All right, so there we have it. If we weren't sure exactly what type of bias and prejudice, uncloaked, no one out in the open is going on at the UN. This is what is happening. There's definitely no fairness, definitely no objectivity in the UN. There's some real deep anti-Israel bias. And the same thing is, of course, happening in the media. Let's read this next text, which is the entire article appears as an additional reading in the back of this lesson. And I actually really want to encourage you to read it because it's an unbelievable article, very powerful. Here's a small little excerpt. Larry, it's a bit long. You're up to it? Text 2A, page 222.
Is there anything left to say about Israel and Gaza? Newspapers this summer have been full of little else. Television viewers see heaps of rubble and plumes of smoke in their sleep. A representative article from a recent issue of the New Yorker described the summer events by dedicating one sentence each to the horrors in Nigeria and Ukraine, 4 sentences to the crazed genocidaries of ISIS, and the rest of the article, 30 sentences to Israel and Gaza. Israeli actions are analyzed and criticized, and every flaw in Israeli society is aggressively reported. In one 7-week period, from November the 8th to December 16th, 2011, I decided to count the stories coming out of our Bureau on the various moral failings of Israeli society. I counted 28 separate articles, an average of a story every 2 days. In a very conservative estimate, this 7-week tally was higher than the total number of significantly critical stories about Palestinian government and society, including the totalitarian Islamists of Hamas that our Bureau had published in the preceding 3 years. The Hamas Charter, for example, calls for not just for Israel's destruction, but for the murder of Jews, and blames Jews for engineering the French and Russian revolutions and both world wars. The charter was never mentioned in print when I was at the AP, although Hamas won a Palestinian national election and had become one of the region's most important players. To draw the link with this summer's events, an observer might think Hamas's decision in recent years to construct a military infrastructure beneath Gaza's civilian infrastructure would be deemed newsworthy, if only because of what it meant about the way the next conflict would be fought and the cost to innocent people. But that is not the case. The Hamas emplacements were not important in themselves and were therefore ignored. What was important was the Israeli decision to attack them. There has been much discussion recently of Hamas attempts to intimidate reporters. Any veteran of the press corps here knows the intimidation is real, and I saw it in action myself as an editor on the AP news desk. During the 2008-2009 Gaza fighting, I personally erased a key detail. The Hamas fighters were dressed as civilians and being counted as civilians in the death toll because of the threat to our reporter in Gaza. The policy was then and remains not to inform readers that the story is censored unless the censorship is Israeli. Earlier this month, the AP's Jerusalem news editor reported and submitted a story on Hamas's intimidation. The story was shunted into deep freeze by his superiors and has not been published.
It's unbelievable. It's like unreal when you read this stuff. But this is what we're dealing with. And the criticism, the hate, the hateful criticism, the anti-Semitic criticism, the biased, heavily biased criticism against Israel is very, very real. And we as Jews have to be very comfortable to call it out as anti-Semitism. Sometimes we're uncomfortable today, we're too sensitive, but if something is not fair, consistently not fair, blatantly unfair, blatantly so subjective, that's definitely what we're dealing with. And here's just a few very powerful headlines and expressions of this. Like I told you, right, that Israeli kills dog in the streets of Paris. So here we go. 3 Palestinians killed as daily violence grinds on, and it's cropped in this picture. If you look in your books on page 225, yes, you have to read the fine print. The big print is that 3 Palestinians were killed, and there's daily violence. If you look in the caption of the picture, you'll find out that there was a shooting and stabbing attack. So it's not like 3 people just got randomly shot by the police. These were terrorists. Another alleged Palestinian stabber shot by Israeli cops. So it's only alleged, and the shooting, that's for sure what went wrong. This is the National French press, breaking police shoot man who stabbed passenger on Tel Aviv bus. So the news is not that there was a stabbing attack, the news is that the Israeli police shot the man. And last one, Israeli police to shoot man in East Jerusalem, from the AP. No one knows what happened, just Israeli police are shooting people, and you gotta start reading to find out that these were people who were terrorists and who were coming to shoot other people. So this is not news to all of us, we all know it. And this is something that, we Jews, it's a very big obsession of the Jewish community, and rightfully so. What could we be doing about this? It's very disturbing. What could we be doing to get people to start appreciating us and liking us again? Why the hate? What are we doing wrong? And there's all types of ideas that in the Jewish community have been proposed, and we're trying so many different ideas. We have so much hope, sometimes false hope, on different initiatives. And what's very important to realize is that while today we look at this issue as an Israeli issue, the international media, the family of nations being so critical of Israel, this is really just another form of anti-Semitism. We have to realize that this is really ancient. As old as the Jews are, that's how old the hate against us is. And as long as a Jew is going to be alive, that's how long anti-Semitism is going to be lasting. I want to just take a look over here. In your books, you have here a spread. Probably page 227, there's no page number there, right? So it's the page before 229?
Actually, page before 230.
230, okay, 228, 229. And you have your notable incidents of anti-Jewish prejudice and violence throughout history. And this is only a handful. It begins in 1429, before the Common Era, right, over 3,500 years ago, where Pharaoh enslaved the Jews in Egypt. And the final one on the list is the 2008 targeted slaughter of Jews in Mumbai. And so many events in between. And what you'll see is that anti-Semitism is not limited in any way. It's not limited to a specific time period. It's not limited to a specific geographical location. It's not limited to culture or religion. It always comes back, it's very similar themes. There's like the top 2, 3, 4 themes of anti-Semitism. And I once read that there's really 10, altogether, if you look throughout history, there's 10 different forms of anti-Semitism. There's a lot of overlap also. It always comes back the exact same way. And it's tremendously consistent. You know, it's a constant throughout history. It's like, it's crazy. You know, even just think about this. There was anti-Semitism recorded in Japan. There are like less than 1,000 Jews who live in Japan. And the Japanese are not one of the Abrahamic religions. You know, these are not the Christians or the Arabs who have a lot of, you know, there's a lot of generational, whatever you want to call it. It's part of the culture. You know, hating Jews is very part of Christian and Arabic culture. They don't have that. And yet, anti-Semitism is still there. So we have to look at anti-Israel sentiments from the larger perspective. Hindsight is 2020. There's a lot we can learn. It's very important that we see it from that perspective. And this is what we say every single year in the Haggadah. Take a look at text 3, page 230. This is one of the most central passages of the Haggadah. We say it is not one individual alone who has risen against us to destroy us, but in every generation they rise against us to destroy us. Started with Pharaoh, we had a Haman, we've had a Hitler, we've had the Spanish Inquisition, we've had everything. We've seen it all. And we have to realize that this is what we're dealing with. It's not limited to Israel, it's not limited to this. This is part of what Jews have been experiencing from day one. We're experiencing it till today. Of course, it always takes on different forms, and we're very fortunate. We're living in a time where, thank God, while anti-Semitism does exist, it's, you know, we are very well protected these days. We're living much more, you know, our quality of life is infinitely better than our ancestors were. But this is a constant. You know, even according to Jewish law, if somebody wants to convert to Judaism, so according to Jewish law, you first try dissuading anybody. You know, in general, Judaism tries encouraging people to stay with their own identity. Every person was created in God's image. Every person has a purpose in this world. You don't have to change. And Jewish law clearly says that the rabbis have to warn somebody who wants to convert. They have to give a warning. I want you to know we are the most persecuted people in history. And if you join our club, you're signing up for some big trouble. It's literally part of the conversion process. We give everybody a clear warning. We're not, this is no free lunch over here. We don't live easy lives. We deal with anti-Semitism. That's the first important things to realize. I just want to make a quick note over here. I'm not at all suggesting that every Gentile, every non-Jew is an anti-Semite, but God forbid. History has proven that we've had so many good friends and loyal friends, good people, really good people, called righteous Gentiles, who've come to our defense, risked their lives, especially in the Holocaust. We know that has happened. So we're not saying that everybody is an anti-Semite, not at all. What we are saying is that anti-Semitism as an institution, as something that exists, is always going to be there. So the question is, of course, why? Why is there always anti-Semitism? And today especially, we usually have the comfort of trying to figure out anti-Semitism. Throughout most of history, when you're dealing with anti-Semitism, you had very little time to try to fix the problem. It was too strong, it was too acute, and it was too violent to even try to fix it. Today, we really think we could fix anti-Semitism. And today, we, in the Jewish community, we fall into a trap. We say, if we just change this, we just tweak this feature, then everybody will start liking us. And unfortunately, it would be wonderful if it was that easy. Just change that one little thing, and then everyone's going to like us. It's not the way it works. If you look at history, you'll see no matter what condition Jews were under, anti-Semitism still found a way to express itself. So you tell me, what are the top given reasons, rationales, not to explain, not to justify, but just to explain the phenomena? What makes the world hate us so much? What are the top given reasons that people give? What do you say? What do you say, Larry? Go ahead.
People in the world have to have a scapegoat.
Oh, they have to have a scapegoat?
They have to.
And we are it.
They can't be without it.
Okay. Why?
We're unable to do that.
You're saying everybody needs somebody to blame.
Absolutely.
And we are that. Okay. What else? Does somebody want to? Joel, go ahead.
We look different as a people
We
than
look
those
different.
around us.
We're a sore thumb, right?
Right.
We're so different. We're begging for it. We're asking for it. Yishtech. Oh, but do we look different? Not everybody, not in all times. We'll get there. Yeah.
We rejected their religions.
We rejected their religions. We rejected their gods. They claimed that we killed their gods. The joke goes, there was once a Christian who came over to a Jew and says, I don't trust you Jews. You killed my God. So he said, that's right. And if I killed your God, can you only imagine what I could do to you? All right, so what else? What else do we got? Go ahead, Tom.
I think to a large extent, in Israel and Jewish people haven't promoted themselves in a very advantageous ways. In that, I remember in the 08, 09 period, they would, during the wars with Hamas, they would bring out Ariel Sharon to speak for the Israeli people. The optics of him didn't present a weak.
We look like the Goliath.
We look like we're gonna bomb the hell out of them, and if they act up, we're gonna bomb them some more.
We look too strong, so therefore the world doesn't have any sympathy for us. The world likes taking the underdog side, right?
Rather than taking a very cute young Israeli girl or a handsome young man and standing in the playground, we're fighting because they're throwing bombs to the places where our kids.
Right, I hear you. One second. I want to make sure everybody gets a chance over here.
Yeah, for 2,000 years, we sent out mice.
Okay. Did we always look so strong? That's
And
maybe.
they hated us then too.
Right. They hated us
And
even.
to some extent, people hate people they don't know.
Oh,
You hate
then
them
there's
you
maybe
don't
just a
know.
prejudice, racism to anybody. Then there's lack of knowledge. They don't know us. When they'll get to know us better, right? When they get, they'll.
Even a lack of knowledge, like you mentioned, we were the money lenders. Well, most people don't understand why that was. It's a lack of knowledge that it was forced on us, so to speak. And the people that were envious didn't know that it was forced on us and that they were put in that position.
That's right.
You know?
You weren't allowed to own land.
We weren't allowed to own land.
They became merchants.
So we had to become the money lenders. Also, Christians weren't allowed to charge interest, so therefore they basically forced the Jews into that business. You know, I'll break it down into two things. Let's focus on two things. Some people think it's a religious issue, religious theology. That is now there's no question, the creators of a lot of the current forms of anti-Semitism. We're talking about stuff like the ghettos, the idea that Jews are leeches on society, we're parasites, ideas that Jews are always stealing and cheating the non-Jews. There's no question about it. This does come from Christian culture, but you cannot in any way claim that anti-Semitism is limited to a religion or specific religions or any religion at all. Just think about the greatest atrocities in the modern age against the Jewish people. The Holocaust. That was not a religious institution, the Nazis. That was highly secular. It was anti-religious, as well as communism, the USSR. And I want to read this with you. It's also a very fascinating text from Nathan Sharansky, text 4, page 232. And I think this is a very informative text over here. So Toby, are we holding by you?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Toby.
What makes the Soviet case destructive is in no small measure the fact that the professed purpose of communism was to abolish all nations, peoples, and religions, those great engines of exclusion on the road to creation of a new world and a new man. In the eyes of Stalin and his henchmen, the Jews start with loyal communists among them, were always suspect, ideological immigrants in the telling phase. But the animosity went beyond Jewish communists. The Soviet regime declared war on over 100 nationalities and religion under its boot. Whole peoples were deported, entire classes destroyed, millions starved to death, and tens of millions killed. Everybody suffered, not only Jews. But decades later, long after Stalin's repression had given way to Khrushchev's thaw, only one national language, Hebrew, was still banned in the Soviet Union. Only one group, the Jews, was not permitted to establish schools for its children. Only in the case of one group, the the Jews did the term fifth line, referring to the space reserved for nationality on a Soviet citizen's identification paper, became a code for license discrimination.
It's an unbelievable piece of information. People think that it wasn't, the communists weren't only against Jews, they were against everybody. Then when you actually look a little bit deeper into it, you realize, no. There was real anti-Semitism at play. They were specifically against Jews, more than anybody else. One more text. This is a very powerful text. Text 6. It's written by a more contemporary rabbi. His name is Rabbi Menachem Zemba, and he was actually a rabbi in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it's a fascinating history. He actually had multiple chances to escape the ghetto. The Vatican even wanted to save him because he was a tremendous scholar, and they knew that it would be a massive loss if he was killed. And he says, I'm a rabbi, I can't leave my people. And he was killed in the ghetto. And this is what he writes. He wrote this towards the beginning of the Holocaust. And it's a real, it's a real wake-up call, this type of text. Let's read text 6. Richard, you're up, page 234.
Many seek to uncover the root cause and justifications for anti-Semitism. History has demonstrated, however, that not a single cause is correct. The hatred defies cause or reason. Here they hate the Jews because they are capitalists. There they hate them because they are socialists. Here they hate the Jews because they are industrious and shrewd. There they hate them because they are a burden on society and provide no benefit to the citizenry. Here they hate the Jews because they are excessively religious and zealous. There they hate them because they are liberal, enlightened, and promulgate secular views. The reasons are always contradictory.
This is the key point. The reasons are always contradictory. Anti-Semitism makes no sense. And really, if you look historically, anti-Semitism is a law of nature. It's a fact. It exists. No matter what we've done to try, no matter any condition, it always pop back up. It's like whack-a-mole, you know that game? You try hitting it down here, it pops up over there. You think you'll knock it down and answer anti-Semitism by this tactic, it shows up in a whole different form. It makes no sense, but it's simply there. What we do see is anti-Semitism does change in form. What are they against? If Jews are religious, they hate the fact that we're too different. If we're fully integrated, like the Jews in Germany before World War II, it's very painful. The Jews in Germany, they thought, the Nazis would never touch us. We're one of them. And what happened was it was a very painful wake-up call. Beyond the physical pain of the Holocaust, it was tremendous emotional pain. We thought we could trust you. We thought we're one of you. And what we have to realize is anti-Semitism simply changes its expression, but in essence, it's always the same. To use terminology that unfortunately we are quite familiar with these days, it's a virus that simply mutates. Same virus. We'll take on a little bit of a new form. We'll look a little bit different. We'll give it a new name. It used to be called anti-Semitism. Today we'll call it anti-Israel. It mutates, but in essence, it's just the same thing. Let's read that in text 7. Such a powerful text from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. Text 7, Shauna, page 235.
Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. A virus is attacked to the human body, but the body itself is an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in doing so, defeats the immune system set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. This is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion had lost prestige. The supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudosciences: social Darwinism, the idea that in society as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race. By the late 20th century, science had lost its prestige. having given us the power to destroy life on earth. Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews, or the Jewish state, are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity.
Oh, ridiculous.
There we go. There we have it. We have to realize, again, this is a very important conclusion. We can't victimize ourselves by claiming we are doing something wrong. The key is in our hands to stop the racism, the hate against us. We have to realize we're not doing anything wrong. We're just driving ourselves more crazy by trying to solve it by really already tested bad ideas that always fail to work and only end up in even more disappointment and even more pain. Which is a little bit of a sobering conclusion to reach, that we experience anti-Israel sentiment. And we sometimes even get upset at Israel. You know, why is Israel presenting itself this way and not that way? And why are they? No matter what you do, it's not going to help. You know, Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, and he famously really pursued peace. He really felt it. He really wanted to finally fix the problem. And he famously went all out, really overextended himself. That led to, of course, the famous Oslo Accords. And as soon as they signed the Oslo Accords, he says, now they're going to all accept us. Now we made peace. There's no more legitimate reason to be anti-Israel. He was so convinced he just solved the problem. And unfortunately, if you actually look at history, the biggest hate and bias actually started from after the Oslo Accords. It's very important to simply face reality. Anti-Semitism, in whatever form it decides to appear at the current age, at the current time period, it's simply going to be there. The amazing thing is that the Torah describes and discusses this phenomenon. It's in the book of Numbers. We're going to read text 11. This is a key text for tonight. In text 11, it's from the Torah portion called Balak. Balak was an anti-Semite, a non-Jewish king, and he hated the Jews. This is in the time period that the Jews are in the desert, the 40 years in the desert. This is one of the nations that the Jews interface with during their travels in the desert. And Balak hires a non-Jewish prophet whose name was Bilam. Bilam was a non-Jewish prophet, whatever that means. There's Jewish prophets, and he had a power of prophecy, but not holy. And King Balak hires the prophet Bilam to curse the Jews. And Bilam opens up his mouth, and instead of curses, what comes out? A beautiful string of compliments, of blessings, of the most complimentary things you could ever hear about the Jewish people. And it's a beautiful set of verses to read. And King Balak asks Bilam, what just happened over here? I hired you to curse the Jews. He says, I cannot violate the word of God. These are blessed people. I can't even curse them. That's what the prophet Bilam says. But Bilam says something, and this is considered a blessing. This is said as a compliment. But I want to analyze this verse with you. Text 11, page 239. In the middle of all of his blessings and compliments, he says the sentiment. Text 11. Behold, it is a people that dwells alone and is not reckoned among the nations. We are a sore thumb, in simple English, right? We dwell alone, nobody reckons us, we're always a little bit off. We can never fully integrate. Bilam said this as a compliment. Do you take it as a compliment? In fact, when Yitzhak Rabin said that now they're going to accept us, he quoted this verse. He said, now it's not going to be anymore. Am levadad yishkom. No more will we be a people that dwell alone. That's what Yitzhak Rabin said. He quoted this verse. We could look at it and look at it as an unfortunate fact of reality. We're so weird. We're so off. The world just refuses to accept us. But the Torah records it as a compliment. Where the truth is, it's up to you to decide what you'll make it as. Is it a curse or is it a blessing? It's up to your interpretation. But the Torah is saying this as a fact of life. And in the thousands of years that have gone by, this verse has remained true. No matter what we've done, we dwell alone, will never be counted as an equal. We're always different. It's a force. It's a force in nature. The Jews are different. And anti-Semitism is simply an expression of the fact that it's built into the DNA, into the laws of nature, Jews are different. We have to embrace it. First of all, it always makes sure that we're distinct. It enables us to shine and be who we are, a light unto the nations. We're not meant to be just another person on the street. We're meant to be providers. We're meant to be givers. We're meant to be leaders to the world. And nature is built to literally force us into that reality. So the first step in understanding anti-Israel sentiment is, number one, to accept it as a fact of nature, as a law of nature. The Torah speaks about it at the very formation of ourselves as a people, before we've come to even really get to see uphand the horrors of anti-Semitism. We have to accept it. We have to know that historically speaking, we've done everything, we've been there, we've done that. Like Einstein said, the definition of a fool is somebody who tries doing the same thing and expects different outcome, different results, right? We've tried it all. And we have to embrace that identity. That identity not from a position of weakness, but the way the prophet, the non-Jewish prophet Bilam meant it, as a compliment, as a strength. I want to share with you right now a fascinating video. And I was debating if I should show it to you because it's a bit lengthy. It's 10 minutes. But I want you, instead of me sharing it with you, I want to show it to you directly. In 1972, Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who I've just quoted, was sent by the President of Israel, President Shazar, to meet the Rebbe in honor of his 70th birthday. And Yitzhak Rabin shared in an interview what the conversation was. And it's very powerful. It's so deep and so rich. And it's on, go ahead, Shana. It's on what we're talking about here. So here we go.
Yitzhak Rabin served as Prime Minister of Israel from 1974 to 77 and from 1992 to 95. In 1972, he was serving as Israel's ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Yehuda Avner was a member of Rabin's staff in Washington at the time.
It's the Rebbe's 70th birthday. And I remember next morning going into his office and saying to him, Yitzhak, I'd like to escort you to the Rebbe and you bring him greetings on behalf of President Shazar. Oh yes, and I remember Rabin saying, he didn't want any mishuga time in the middle of the night. And so we waited for 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We come there, we climb the steps, and we go into the waiting room on the right-hand side. And who's in the waiting room? Herman Wouk, the author, was there with his mother. Now, Rabin knew Wouk very well. They were very good friends because Washington, and I also knew Herman Wouk. And Herman said that he was bringing a letter to the Rebbe from the president on the occasion of his birthday. This is what I recall. President Nixon. Eventually we are ushered in to the Rebbe, the 2 of us. The Rebbe behind his desk, Rabin on this side, I'm next to him. He looks around, a stark room, absolutely no decoration, only Sfarim. Not only Sfarim, the old Sfarim, top Matted Svarim. He'd never been in such a room in his life.
Well, the first impression that I remember is the eyes of the rabbi. Blue, penetrating eyes that express wisdom, awareness, and deep penetration. This I remember more than anything else from the first impression and the impression that followed later on during the discussion, the eyes of the rabbi. At the beginning, we started, and the rabbi stressed that the discussion will be in Hebrew. It was a perfect Hebrew, but with the expression that my ears were not too well tuned for them. I remember quite vividly this discussion. It started by a question that was put to me by the rabbi. Aren't you feel alone as the representative of the Jewish state among 120 countries and peoples that are represented in Washington? From this beginning, the rabbi started to deal with the question, Am levadad ishkon, what has kept the people of Israel always, little bit alone, by choice or by outside pressure or rejection? It's by the two forces. First, by our own choice, by the Jewish people's own choice, to be what they are, to stick to the Torah, to the faith, to the tradition of the Jewish people for 2,000 years, without a state. Inquisition, expulsion, pogroms, no doubt the Holocaust. And regardless to all this, the Jewish people remain faithful to the Jewish religion, to the Jewish tradition, and succeeded to survive what no people anywhere in the world proved to be successful, and have never lost their dream, their hope to return to Zion, to Jerusalem, to the land of Israel. He added also that pressures from the outside helped us not to be assimilated, the combination of the positive and the negative.
When the Rebbe said that this is the natural state of the Jewish people, that it will always walk alone in the world, that it will always be a part of history, but it will always pursue its own narrative in history. I know that I was sitting at the edge of my chair, fascinated, and Rabin I saw was also tremendously interested in what he was hearing for the first time of a conceptualization of Israel's place within the family of nations. And that he, Rabin, who had been brought up as in a socialist Jewish family, Zionist socialist Jewish family, on the notion of principle of normalization. The whole concept of secular Zionism was to normalize the situation of the Jewish people by having a state of its own. And anti-Semitism will wither away. And here is the Rebbe saying to Rabin that the natural state of the Jewish people in history is to be abnormal, which flew in the face of all the Zionist teachings, the socialist Zionist secular teaching that Rabin had been reared on. And the Rebbe, in order to prove his thesis, quoted the one Gentile prophet that appears in the whole of Tanakh. Hein am levadad yishkon v'goyim lo yitchashav. This is a people that shall dwell alone and shall not be counted among the nations. Said the Rebbe, one does not have to be a mystic. Lo tzarechim liot mystikan, in order to acknowledge that this is the historic reality of the Jewish people throughout the whole of its chronicles. We have always dwelt alone. And Medinas Yisrael, the state of Israel, will not change that divine reality. Hence came his question, do you ever feel lonely as ambassador in Washington, D.C.? And as I say, I was gawking at hearing this. And Rabin was beguiled. And then they went back to talking about Washington affairs.
Then we discussed other issues that were actual, well, part of the current events in the relationship between Israel and the United States. And it was quite a moving experience. He had a practical approach, especially when we discussed the importance of Jewish education. This was another subject that the rabbi raised and said to me that his main purpose is to spread, to be active, to send all his disciples to work on Jewish education wherever and whenever it is possible. He then discussed with me what then was not a matter of public knowledge, his efforts to penetrate beyond the Iron Curtain to reach the Jewish communities in the various parts of the Soviet Union.
He also spoke about, he paid tribute to Rabin as a commander, chief of staff during the Six-Day War. And then he, the Rebbe, recalled of how the war, the initial origins of the war. He spoke about the Syrian attempt to divert the headwaters of the River Jordan. Rabin was taken aback by that. I'm talking about 1966, when the Syrians tried to dry out Israel by diverting the tributaries in their territory, the Syrian territory, of the River Jordan. And we had just completed what is called a national water carrier, which was the transfer of surplus waters from the north into the Negev, the desert in the south. And it was this that had prompted the Syrians to try and divert the water resources. And Rabin, who was already then chief of staff, was conducting a war with the Syrians of an exchange of cannon fire while we were trying to destroy the dredges and the tractors that were working on the diversions scheme. And in retrospect, the Rebbe was saying, would you not agree? This was the beginning of the countdown to the Six-Day War. And Rabin expressed amazement at the fact that the Rebbe grasped something that most Israelis never understood. In other words, a broader perspective of not simply the Egyptians entering into Sinai and so forth, but the origins, the real origins of the Six-Day War. When we left, so first of all, I didn't say a word to Rabin. You know, it's quite a drive. We were now driving from Crown Heights to the airport to fly back to Washington. So we had time, so we started off in silence. And then I said, Nu ma dadcha, what do you think? And he said to me, that man knows more about what's happening in the Middle East than many members of the Knesset.
So, what you see over here is, and it's very interesting that, as I mentioned, Yitzhak Rabin was the one who said many years later, now we're not going to be a people of Am Levadat Yishkon, the people who are going to dwell alone. Now we're not anymore going to be a people who dwell alone, which is exactly what the Rebbe spoke to him about. And the Rebbe reminded him in years later, in the late 70s, don't forget about our discussion that we're people who dwell alone. Accepting the Jewish mission and the Jewish purpose, the divine mission of the Jewish people is to realize and to accept that this is our reality. We're people who dwell alone. We're never going to be accepted. We shouldn't be accepted. That's not our role in history and society. That's not what God put us on this world for. We're always going to be different. We're never going to be fully accepted. And we have to act that way and realize that that's how it's going to work. History has proven we could really never rely even on friends. During the Holocaust, unfortunately, what was the ship? The MSS Lewis, right? Was it the St. Louis, MS St. Louis, right? From Canada, from America. 6-Day War, the world, right? Shot still. The world didn't even dip a pinky into the whole issue. So what is really the secret of the Jewish people? What is our answer to anti-Semitism? How do we deal with it? Let's read text 10. And Marion, we're up to you. Page 238, text 10. This is where it's at.
The Roman Emperor Hadrian said to Rabbi Yehoshua, "Great is the sheep that survives in the midst of 70 wolves." Rabbi Yehoshua responded, "Great is the shepherd who saves the sheep, protects it, and vanquishes the wolves that wish to eat it."
So the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who was, by the way, one of the most anti-Semitic and violent emperors against the Jewish people, exclaimed. The sages, by the way, kept very good diplomatic, not necessarily good, but they've always kept a very strong diplomatic channel with the different Roman emperors, which would change overnight very often. Lots of assassinations have happened there. Great as the sheep, right? The Jews are so powerful. They survive in the midst of 70 menacing wolves. And Rabbi Yehoshua, the great sage, says, you got it wrong. The sheep is not doing it on its own. The sheep is too vulnerable to survive. This is really all God, the shepherd of the Jewish people, saving them. And this is what we have to realize. This is really the secret of the Jewish survival, of our immortality. It's that there's a great shepherd who takes care of us, who put us, on the one hand, in such a precarious situation where a nation that dwells alone will never be reckoned with all the nations. It won't happen. We're in such a fragile, vulnerable situation. At the same time, God is always there and says, I'm keeping you going. It's like a tension within nature. Jews exist. Jews need to be there. We have a role. Part of that unique role is that the world will never fully accept us. And God is always there to counterbalance that and say, you're always going to survive. And therefore, we have to realize that whenever we speak about Jewish survival, the survival of the Jewish people in Israel, the future of our own children, our own grandchildren, the future of the Jewish state, we have to always talk about it in miraculous terms. Right? We've spoken about this last week. Different groups said it was a miracle. Some denied it was a miracle. It's a miracle. There's no doubt about it. If you look at the continuum of Jewish history, we are simply a living miracle. And we have to see it from that perspective. And therefore, whenever we're dealing with a threat, on the one hand, God does want us to use diplomatic channels, to work within the family of nations to try to remove the threat. But ultimately, the way we get out of any problem, our survival is always going to be miraculous. It's always going to be divine intervention. And this is why in Jewish traditions, it's a very key thing, that Jews specifically, we are beyond nature. When we need help with our survival, we have to turn to God. We have to work our miracles. It's not enough for us to work just within nature. Ultimately, we need to work with miracles. Let's go back to the beginning. We spoke about the water Why did God put the Jewish people in a place that has no natural water? Because it's like a constant reminder. Don't look at the world for your security. In fact, the world offers you no security. Your only security comes from above. Let's read that in text 12. This is one of the great commentaries Rabbeinu Bechaye explains. In the Torah, text 12, page 239, go for it, Alan.
God did not give you a self-irrigating land like Egypt so that you would not be able to water the land for yourself. Instead, your attention will always turn to him and the key to the rain that he holds.
It's a reminder. God is reminding us we're a different type of people. The Egyptians, their security comes from natural resources. The whole Jewish story is that we're totally beyond that. We're always looking to God, and God in turn is giving us his protection. And I want to go back to, we read the verse from the Torah where Moses warns the Jewish people that you're entering into a land that has no water like the Egyptians. And I want to read that again with you and read one more verse. Text 13, it's Jafar Bayou, page 240.
But the land that you are crossing, the Jordan River, to possess is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. It is a land that your God cares for the eyes of your God are continually upon it from the beginning of the year to its end.
You see, that's how Moses frames it. No water, it's only going to be coming from rain from heaven, but it's a land that God cares for. God is always watching the land. That's how Moses frames the entire story of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And that's really the Jewish response to anti-Semitism, to the challenges. Ultimately, it's always going to be miraculous. And what better modern day example for that is there, better than the 6-Day War? That's the story of the 6-Day War. The pundits were real. There should have been another Holocaust, God forbid. Naturally speaking, that's what could have happened. That's what should have happened. The whole thing was one big miracle, rain from heaven. You know, last week, and I want to conclude with this thought. I have one more video to show you. This is a wonderful video. It's such a powerful part of the story, of the history of the 6-Day War. So last week I showed you the video, we spoke about the story about how before the war, everybody was expressing doom, horror, the tension was in the air. Even the Israeli leadership didn't even have the words to comfort the Jewish people, the Israeli people. And the only voice, the only one who came out and said unequivocally, there's gonna be good news, there's gonna be miracles, was the Rebbe, right? 8 days before the war, he came out and publicly said, we're gonna see miracles, there's gonna be security in the land of Israel, Jews are gonna continue to live there. And it was like crazy. It was, and for 8 days, the Jews are sitting at the edge of their chairs, and the Rebbe was the only voice, who just wouldn't back down, saying, we're gonna have good news. 2 days before the war begins. War begins Monday morning, June 5th. June 3rd, Shabbat. The Rebbe, in those years, every month, once a month, held a public farbrengen, a gathering on Shabbos. And the Rebbe said, war's about to come. What can we do? What can we do about it? What can we do to help our brothers and sisters in the land of Israel? And the Rebbe said something very interesting. And it was a historical moment in American Jewish history as well. The Rebbe said every mitzvah has a different effect. Every mitzvah that we do does something else, accomplishes something else. And the Rebbe said there's one mitzvah that specifically is all about Jewish security, especially in the face of enemies. What is that mitzvah? It's tefillin. And the Rebbe quoted a piece of Talmud, which is in text 14. You want to read it, Tom? Text 14, page 241.
All the nations of the earth will see that God's name is invoked upon you, and they will fear you. It was taught that Rabbi
Eliezer the Great.
Eliezer the Great. This is a reference to the tefillin of the head upon which the name of God is written.
So Rebbe then said, look, tefillin brings God's blessings of security, that the nations will see that God's name is upon you, and they will fear you. And the Rebbe announced that on Shabbos. The Rebbe launched Chabad's Tefillin campaign, which was the very first mitzvah campaign of Chabad. The whole concept of Chabad guys going to offices and the streets of Manhattan It all started here right before the 6-Day War. And I want to show you a little video that discusses it. So here's our last video for today. Actually, if you want, I'll give you even an encore, one more video. But we're gonna, and then after this, we're gonna conclude.
I recall Shabbos before the war erupted, Parshat Bamidbar. The Rebbe spoke by the Farbrengen that the commandment of Tefillin brings about God's blessing to protect the Jewish people from dangers around them and to bring long life to the Jewish people. Therefore, the Rebbe asked in these tense days, everyone should try to put on tefillin with as many Jewish people as possible. Our sages tell us on the passage of the Torah that says that all the nations of the world will see that the name of God is called upon you and they will fear you. And our sages ask, where do we see that the name of God is called upon you? And the answer, this is the tefillin שבראש.
אז הרבי דיבר שכשיוצאים למלחמה, השם רוצה שהאויב יסבט לגמרי, וגם כי יש את העניין שלו נפקד ממנו איש. אחד הדברים המסוגלים מאוד לדבר הזה, אז יש את העניין של תפילין. אז הרב ביקש שיניחו עם חיילים תפילין, שזה יהיה ההגנה על חייהם, ההגנה על שמירה.
ורוא כל עם ואורץ כי שם השם נקרא לך, המזאת das geht idische Zove, wo sehr Anführer ist an die Shem Elekea Zwois. Is hat dämmelt wie Jorum wie Mekka, da schreckt man sich vor sie. Wenn Nossum die Panecha beschäfer drochen, man bleibt vor sie. Der Zatsche Kenege der Zed, is Chotscha viele Vasiuli Chose, is Maslayu Chose, der Zed es aber sein Masel Shebashomayim und schluckt sich nicht und bleibt.
אז כמובן שכל אחד עשה ככל יכולתו, זה לא היה מאורגן, אלא כל אחד מצא תפילין, לא ידענו על המבצע הזה בכלל, ולפני כן לא היה דבר כזה.
Right after Shabbat, the words of the Rebbe were spread throughout the whole world. And from Sunday morning on, Chabad Hasidim around the world began the Tefillin campaign.
החלו חסידי חב"ד על פי הוראת הרבי מלובביץ' במבצע תפילין. הם יצאו לרחובות לשכנע את העוברים ושבים להניח תפילין כדי להציל את העם ולהטיל אימה על אויבינו.
כבר במהלך המערכה ראינו את מבצעי הנחת התפילין. ברקה וולף אמר לי, נוסעים לסיני, אתה בא? אני נסעתי כי רציתי עוד אולי כתבה מפה, כתבה משם. נסענו לכל מיני מקומות. טנדר מרופט, שאני לא יודע מאיפה נלקח, כן אישורים, לא אישורים, נסענו. פתאום רואים חייל עומד מחכה לטרמפ, הנחת בוקר תפילין, לא. הניחו לו תפילין, תמשיך בהצלחה בדרך.
זה יהיה מתנדגו. Beshem Hawaii keiner Nidgel, betrug mir wie sie gewähnt, angeschrieben, Mika, Mecha, Bakelim. Hawaii geht mir nicht mit Shem Hawaii, zusammen wie das ist, Nikra Lecha durch Anoches Tfilin, Lemale Shlichusam HaGdesha LaHagona, al Bitochen von Eretz HaKedish und Bitochen von Gei Kodesh, was gefindt sich in Eretz HaKedish.
Israel, roughly the size of New Jersey, was surrounded by an Arab world 50 times its size. But in 6 days, the war was over.
It's the first time in 19 years that Jews have been allowed to visit and pray at the site of the sacred Wailing Wall.
הפחד החליף את מקומו לתחושה של שמחה והרגשת תחושת נס גדול והצלה.
המונים באו לכותל, אלפי אנשים. אז פנה אלינו רב שרוי לייבוב, שהוא היה מנהל של ציר אגודס חב"ד, והרב דרש לנצל את האפשרות הזאת להניח עם משהו יותר אנשים תפילין.
הרב לייבו קיבל מברק מהרב, ועכשיו צריך עוד להגביר את מבצע תפילין. הרב הוסיף עכשיו, כיוון ששוחרר הכותל המערבי, צריך להקים שם דוכן, להנחת תפילין לאלה שלא יניחו תפילין במשך היום, ובאותו דוכן יניחו אותם תפילין. עשו איזה, ארגנו איזה שולחן קטן במעלית והתחילו להניח תפילין.
Nobody had ever really done this before. A word like outreach, everyone thinks that's been a part of the Jewish vocabulary since the days of Abraham. After all, Abraham engaged in outreach. But the truth is, the Rebbe was the first Jewish leader ever, at least since post-biblical times, who considered and constructed an active program of outreach to all Jews. In the 13th century, Rabbi Moses of Kusi went out in France and encouraged Jews who weren't wearing tefillin or weren't putting mezuzahs on their doors, and he did a sort of outreach campaign. That's one rabbi in the 13th century, and in a very limited way. So it was really hard to find a precedent for somebody who did this in a systematic way.
Aber gerade das Sanag ist ein Chibel-Sefer mit Gott. Also herumgefahren mit Medinas Fall, und Medinas Androbuse, ich bin Rosenfahrer für Medinas. Gefahren nach Medina, was jeden Tag nicht geweckt wird. Und er sagt, hinter allein gefahren, allein gerät, und wenn was er gerät, weil jeden Herz ein jeden lebt und lenkt wird. Das Sanag hat das erzählt, was er das erzählt. Aber so wissen Sie, wie mit sich finden. Zurück im Detail habe ich doch nicht, was wir schon nutzen, also das länger mal zu filmen. Ich muss es auch nicht rauschauen, als Karkartel im Mann zu filmen. Übergelegt 91 Mal zu filmen. Nannte mal es von dem Zug, Karkartel im Mann zu filmen. Ich stellte mal an in dem Zug, vom Mann zu filmen. Ich bin noch in der Missverständnis gewesen.
To Jerusalem, and our free stop was at the Wailing Wall. And if that won't move you, nothing in the world will.
Schaß mit tut a jinische Teil mit Zwisel, darf wir wissen sein, dass er nebige Sache. Bald hat man alle gewinnt Ziva, a Kodesh Baruch Hu, wird das a Jini, was darf sein, a Dover am Iskayi, bis a Pullen im Sheches, a Zekel auf a David.
זה היה מדהים לראות את זה. אנשים שחזרו למקורם, ראו בחיות, זה ממש הכניס בהם רוח חיה. אז הגיעו למדים של אלפי אנשים ביום, ויכולו לבוא להניח תפילין בכותל.
It was a rare event in Jewish history. The Six-Day War caused a tremendous amount of excitement in the Jewish community all over the world. What happened to mark it in terms of a daily life, except it tefillin? It became such a thing that if you want to visit the Kotel, you have to put on tefillin.
And with that, I think it's time to conclude today's class, this course. The message is, there's a lot we've learned in this course, a lot of wonderful insights in history, and spoke about the survival of our nation. But specifically from today, which is really the sum total of the course, is really we see that we're miraculous people. And sometimes we look at our own little personal lives and we're like, I don't feel so special. I don't feel like I'm a miracle. I don't feel like I'm an anomaly. When you look at the larger picture, and the Six-Day War was such a reminder for that, not only that we are different, and we're always going to be different as we've studied the words of Bilam, it's a fate that we've been destined to. And we just, but we're not just thrown into this crazy fate, we're also a people of miracles. So the 6 Day War is really our story. And all of us, and I want to encourage you, especially in the spirit of the video, let me just shut off the ringer here, especially in the spirit of the video, that tomorrow I want to encourage all the men here to put on tefillin, and I want to make myself available tomorrow or Friday, or if that doesn't work for you, sometime next week, I want to schedule time to visit you in your home or your office. I will put on tefillin, which, as we've seen, was such an important part of the story of the 6 Day War. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining. Such a wonderful experience spending this time with all of you, both here in person as well as all of you on Zoom. And I look forward to seeing you. This is interesting, by the way, some Israeli officials participating in the Tefillin campaign, Ariel Sharon, Chaim Bar-Lev, Ezer Weitzman. And I look forward to seeing you at our next course. I want to wish you all, we're coming up soon to Rosh Hashanah. I want to wish you all have a happy and healthy new year, inscribed and sealed for only good news, only for good things, health. With that, a little bit over time for our grand finale, we conclude for tonight. Thank you all. God bless you all. And we'll see you all again very, very soon, God willing. Thank you once again. And thank you, Bethany Eli Morocco, Nancy Trieste, and Toby and Larry Fox for such a beautiful course. And many more.